and Champaign-Urbana. Even high schools started their own radio stations. An early one here in the Chicago area was Lane Tech High School that started its own radio station. Churches started their own radio stations. Department stores started up their own radio stations as a means of promoting their goods. So famous station started here in Chicago, WLS, was started by, does anyone know which department store? Sears, right? Because the call letters WLS stand for World's Largest Store. Newspapers, fearing competition from this new media, also started radio stations in droves. So the Chicago Tribune Company, under the leadership of Robert McCormick, started WGN. The call letters stand for World's Greatest Newspaper. The Daily News started WMAQ, and so forth. And you also had, here in Chicago, a very interesting innovation, which is, here in Chicago we had a labor-run radio station. In fact, the only labor-run radio station anywhere in the country, WCFL. And since this is a group of people on the left, and I'm a person on the left, I want to spend a little bit more time talking about WCFL, since it's so unique and such a unique part of our broadcasting history. The Chicago Federation of Labor, at the time, was headed up by two guys, the secretary and what was it, the secretary and president, Ed Nockels and John Fitzpatrick, who were very independently minded and radical for leaders of a big metropolitan labor federation. What you've got to remember is the Chicago Federation of Labor, back in the 19-teens, actually started its own labor party and ran its own independent labor candidates because they were not satisfied with the representation they were getting from the Democratic Party, and they felt the Democratic Party was too reformist. In the 1920s, they started up a daily newspaper that was explicitly intended to compete with the capitalist press, with the Daily News, with the Times, and with the Chicago Tribune, because they felt that there needed to be a newspaper for quote-unquote those who toil. And unlike a lot of AFL-affiliated unions and AFL-affiliated union-run newspapers, this newspaper opened its pages up to members of the IWW and later of the Communist Party. They were not scared of being associated with Reds, unlike so many other central labor bodies' newspapers. And so Chicago had a different kind of central labor body, and in particular, the secretary of the CFL, back in the teens and 20s, Ed Nockels, was committed to labor having a voice in radio. And he actually lobbied the AFL and introduced legislations every year at the AFL's convention to push for a network of labor-affiliated radio stations. Well, the AFL was very conservative, and their response was, if unions want to get their message out to the listening public, the way to do it is to rent time from commercial radio stations. Of course, that was a non-starter because the commercial radio stations adamantly refused to rent time to labor unions, no matter how moderate or reformist they might be for their programming. And so Ed Nockels, thanks to his activism, got a radio station started here, which was called WCFL. It broadcast initially from a station, from a studio that located at the very tip of Navy Pier. Because the CFL had so much pull at City Hall, they were able to work out a deal where they were able to rent this vacated studio. It used to be run by the Navy for a single $1 a year to air their programming. They put on a station that was not incredibly dissimilar from a lot of commercial stations. They did carry, the majority of their programming was music and entertainment programming, variety type theater and that sort of thing. But they did carry programming in a variety of different languages, the languages of the members of CFL. So they had programming in Yiddish, they had some programming in the Scandinavian languages, But what was really distinctive about WCFL is their news and public affairs programming came from a labor perspective and was hypercritical of the sort of pro-corporate propaganda that was the rule on WGN, for example, or any of the other area radio stations. I single out WCFL because they had a heck of a time getting on the air. In the early days, in the 1920s, the laws governing the regulation of the airwaves were not very clear-cut. And in fact, the Commerce Department was handling the licensing of radio stations. But the way that it was supposed to work, at least according to the laws that were on the books, was anyone who applied for an open frequency would automatically get a license to broadcast. And yet, when the Chicago Federation of Labor, which had constructed, a transmitter and refurbished the studio and so forth, when they applied to the Commerce Department for a license to start broadcasting, they were told, no, you can't, because the airwaves in Chicago are simply too crowded. And Ed Nockels was actually prepared to start broadcasting without permission of the U.S. government when a pioneering lawsuit came through, the so-called Zenith suit, that basically said that the Commerce Department didn't have the authority to pick and choose who could be on the airwaves because there was no enabling legislation saying that they had a right to deny anyone's application. And so they immediately granted WCFL their license. All right, well, this kind of gives you a little bit of this history of CFL getting on the airwaves. It gives you a little bit of a sense of what the kind of cacophony that prevailed on radio in the 1920s. It wasn't exactly clear what the rules were governing who could get a license or not. It wasn't exactly clear the rules about who could broadcast at what power and on what frequency. It was sort of chaos, especially after this lawsuit that basically said the Commerce Department has to okay any application that comes into it for an open frequency. And so Congress started rushing to regulate the airwaves. And in fact, this might be one of the very few instances in American history where an industry begged the government to regulate it. Begged the government to regulate it. Because the big broadcasters, the big corporate broadcasters, were terrified, were pissed off at the fact that tiny little stations, like stations broadcast by churches and high schools and so forth, that the signals from those stations were interfering with and undercutting their signals and interfering with this very expensive advertising-sponsored programming that they were running. And so legions of lobbyists from various different groups with an interest in the future of broadcasting in the late 1920s descended on Congress to lobby about this kind of the basic regulations that were going to be enacted governing radio. The first outcome of all of that lobbying was what's called the Radio Act of 1927. It's an important piece of legislation. What the Radio Act of 1927 did is it created an independent regulatory body from the Commerce Department called the Federal Radio Commission, the FRC. And it gave the FRC the right to either to accept or deny, importantly, or deny anyone's application for a license to broadcast. And moreover, it sort of laid out some general guidelines for the obligations of licensed broadcast. It bound the holders of broadcast licenses to what's sometimes been called the PCAN principle. It said, in essence, PCAN stands for public interest, convenience, and necessity. And what the Radio Act said was anyone who's licensed to operate a radio station is doing so in the public interest, convenience, and necessity. That they're basically the trustees of a kind of public trust. Now, I got to point out that they got this language directly from public utilities law. You'll find language like this in laws governing electrical systems, sewage systems, and so forth. So they were basically regulating radio, broadcasting,